So I guess what I wish that more mental health professionals knew specifically about, mental health in the context of perinatal loss is again coming back to how grief can be like a traumatic brain injury. So I think a lot of therapists that I've seen tend to want to go right into the grief work. Like talk therapy can be really difficult for that. And I found that I saw a few counselors and I felt that I was telling my story over and over again. And yes, grief wants to be heard. And it was somewhat of a relief to tell those stories, to just have somebody listen. I'm paying you so I can just cry and tell my story. But I didn't feel that it moved me through my grief in any other way than just giving it a listening ear. And I did feel like I needed some support to move that grief through. And so I wish that more people took a trauma informed lens to grief therapy, really understanding. And I should separate those things because not all grief comes with trauma. However, when it comes to perinatal loss, a lot of grief comes with trauma because it's considered traumatic grief because you weren't expecting the death. So oftentimes, like an unexpected death falls under being considered traumatic. So I wish that more therapists would do trauma work with people before they dive into grief work and having them rip their hearts open, telling their very vulnerable stories. I wish that more therapists knew how to help you understand and resource your nervous system first. So polyvagal theory and helping you to understand what pulls you in and out of a parasympathetic nervous state. So making sure before you are working with your thoughts around your grief and your story and your feelings about your child, making sure that you're resourced enough to do that safely so that you don't end up really messed up for the rest of the day after every therapy session. I think a mental emotional hangover is to be expected when you're working through such issues in therapy. But there have been times that I've felt really unhinged afterwards. Like I just didn't get left in a great spot, if that makes sense. So I do wish more therapists understood how to work with trauma in the body and how to help you soothe your extremely damaged and frazzled nervous system because so much perinatal loss comes with trauma and PTSD.
Oh, I love that psychoeducation so much. It's so real.
I wanted to say like grief is an expanding emotion, a
Mm.
connecting emotion. Grief wants to expand. Grief wants to connect with other people and tell its story. But trauma wants to contract. It wants to protect. So when I think about it in this context, if your grief is overlaid with trauma, I know this is silly, but I think about like a glossette raisin, right? So your grief inside is expanding, it's wanting to connect, and your trauma is like this hard, crunchy shell pushing inwards. And so you can imagine the friction and discomfort that causes. Your trauma is like holding your grief in, so to speak. And so when we try to work straight with somebody's grief, it's like painful pushing against that trauma shell. What we really need to do is soften that trauma shell before we can get into the gooey center.